At least you're not Quentin Tarantino. I saw an old friend from high school who had been an artist, and I saw them recently, and they were sitting in their own piss and puke, drunk and panhandling. And I said to them, at least you're not Tarantino. I said to them, look, being an artist is hard because you have to constantly not sell out. Every time the opportunity arises to cash in and sacrifice your artistic integrity, you have to say no. And you do get punished for that, and you do live a very impoverished, lonely life. When I say artistic integrity, I don't mean like some kind of nobility or sense of right and wrong, like a moral thing. I mean like someone says, yeah, we'll buy your song if you change the title to this, and the title changes the whole point of the song. The whole point of the song is now contradicted by the title. So if you're going to make your art inferior in order to make money, then what was the point of even getting into art in the first place? Art is idealism, and compromise is the opposite of art or idealism. Of course, you do have to make compromises, but you have to be very careful what compromises you make. One of my favorite quotes was from a TV show called 24, where the main character, Kiefer Sutherland, says, you know what the difference is between a bad guy and a good guy? The bad guy didn't start out as a bad guy. He was a good guy. But at a certain point, he made the tiniest little compromise. And then that compromise led to another compromise, which led to another compromise. And then a million compromises later, he's a bad guy. Bam, abracadabra. Small compromises lead to bigger compromises, lead to identity collapse. Another reason being an artist is hard is that you have to be everything. You're not just writing your book or writing your song. You're doing the marketing, you're producing, you're editing. You have to learn Photoshop if you're some kind of visual, even if you draw and you don't even use computers. If you write music, you have to learn everything. Producing programs, you got to learn, and you have to learn the smallest things that you never would have thought of. Like writing a book, you have to learn typesetting. I didn't even know what typesetting was, but that's a whole thing that takes hours and hours. As a small artist, you don't have a secretary. You have to clean your own place of business. You don't even have a janitor. And the good thing about ChatGPT is that it's. I look at it like it's enabled us to have a secretary. So even if you're poor, now you got a secretary that can do things for you, like edit this thing that I wrote, or organize blah blah blah. I'm just going to paste it here, organize it for me. Anything you would ask a secretary to do. And as long as you're not doing anything more than that, then I don't think you're misusing ChatGPT, and you're not using it for artistic. You're not trying to cheat being a crappy artist by just entering the shit. No, you're just using it to do what you would ask a secretary to do. But back on to the subject of compromising. A very strong, extreme example of this. I once met a guy in a bar, and I was chatting him up, and he was telling me how he went to university for environmental studies, right? And he got a MA, master's in environmental studies of some sort. Because his reasoning was that he cares about the future of, the climate change and everything. And he wanted to do something good with his life, right? And he said, though, that the second he graduated, all these oil companies were automatically soliciting him, saying, will you come work for us? Because they need credibility. If they can get an environmentalist to say that their oil is good for the planet, then that's invaluable. And he said they were offering him huge amounts of money. So it's like, there you go. You can compromise right there. Now that I think of it, that would be a great way to easily get rich if you don't really care. Or even if you do care, you could be scamming them. You go to school for environmental studies with the express interest of working for oil companies because you know you'll be in high demand. But you could be like a double agent and then, screw them over in the end. Get the check for $1 million and then announce that the whole company is corrupt and awful. One of the solutions I've come to is that we are all capable of corruption, and the secret is to not put yourself in a position where temptation will arise. For example, if you don't want to cheat on your wife, you probably don't want to go to a strip joint and get drunk. Or let's say you're this environmental student and you don't want to end up getting bribed by these assholes. Well, start social pages, YouTube pages where you condemn all the oil companies, and then they're not going to be able to hire you even if they wanted to. So I call it like sabotaging yourself. Or I was telling a very attractive female friend of mine, because she always could have been a model, but she avoided it, and now she's kind of regretting it because she's getting older. But she said that, I said to her, you sabotage yourself. Like, for example, if you know you're hot and you know that agents are going to come up and offer to hire you to be a model, then purposely don't put makeup on when you go out. Purposely, make yourself look ugly. And in the case of being a sellout artist, I mean, you could say, oh, okay, I'll do that crappy piece of art that they're commissioning of me, and I'll take the money for the shitty thing that I write, and then I'll make a really good movie with that money. I bet you a lot of people do that. I know they do. Or, yeah, I'll write that jingle for McDonald's, and I'll use that money to buy my studio so that I can make my real rock music. And the answer I've come to that is that you should just have a day job then. Just work at Taco Bell, work some shitty job, work as a janitor, because you're guaranteed to make money, firstly, because that's the only reason you were going to sell out with that script. You'll put just as much as time into it, but at least you won't be wasting your artistic juices. You can work as a janitor 8 hours a day, then come home and then do the real art in your studio. Because it's too easy for it to be a cop-out, right? I'm only doing this McDonald's jingle so that I can write my great music that I really want to write. Just like people say, oh, I don't have the guts to write my novel, so I'll go to university and I'll study literature, and then I'll get and then it leads to them being a PhD in literature, and then they never wrote that book, but that was the whole point for them getting in the first place. So it's like I always say, the best way to not write a novel is to take a course in how to write a novel. Because then you can tell people you're working on your novel by taking a course. Now, it would be generous to say that Quentin Tarantino only only sold out after Pulp Fiction. That would be generous because, in fact, Quentin Tarantino sold out the very first time he wrote a scene. I admit that Pulp Fiction was something of a masterpiece in terms of plot and time jumps, although Quentin Tarantino was not the sole writer of that movie. So half the credit belongs to Roger Avary. But even though Pulp Fiction was something of a masterpiece in that way, it was still selling out by trying to be cool. That was already a huge sellout. But then it became a lot more drastic and quick of a selling out after Pulp Fiction. You can pretty much pretty much draw out the road of Tarantino's corruption as an artist. Because he makes Kill Bill, right? And that's his first revenge movie, full-on revenge movie. And he didn't realize then that he was just going to make movies about revenge specifically, exclusively. After that, he just thought he was making a movie called Kill Bill. Then he thought of the idea of Inglourious Basterds, where it's like, okay, it's a revenge movie, but this time I've got the bright idea of taking a historical fact and or a minority and having them be or having their enemies be the foil for the revenge story. Like, so that the Nazis are the bad guys in the revenge story, and now I can get away with having extreme brutal murder as long as the person being murdered is some despicable historical villain. And although Inglourious Bastards, although that was a terrible movie, there was still some effort in like plot and writing, I think, even though I think it largely failed, almost entirely failed. But his subsequent movies, Django Unchained, culminating in like Django Unchained and Once Upon a Time, I think he threw away even the idea of writing a plot. And he was just like, okay, no, it's just a flat out revenge movie. I don't give a shit. Like, it doesn't matter. Who cares? It doesn't, let's just have a lot of details. We'll call them Calvin Candy, and, these are the names of the characters. But otherwise, there's really no story. Don't worry about it. And all the movies are identical. You could take out the bride, pluck her out of Kill Bill, and then switch her with the character from Django Unchained. And then all you really need to do is just change the settings. So, instead of the Old West, have it be, ninja background. And you could do Kill Bill as Django Unchained. You can interchange the stories. Nothing really needs to be changed because blah, blah, blah. Every single action scene could have occurred in any of those movies. In other words, there's nothing plot or character specific to any of these movies. Anything can be anywhere. It doesn't matter. I compromised by putting my books on Amazon. It bothers me selling out. It bothers me that Jeff Bezos gets like $4 off of every book I sell. It bothers me that I wanted to sell the books for $100 each on Amazon because I don't really give a shit if anybody buys them because, well, I don't know why. It just doesn't really matter to me. But I found out that if I sold them for $100 a copy, that still means that Amazon gets 40%. And I didn't realize that, so forget it. I'm not helping them make more money. When I started out as an artist, I just call myself a wannabe artist. When I started out, I was like, okay, my main goal is to be remembered after I die. But now it looks like we're not going to, there's not going to be any future anyway. So there's not going to be anybody to remember me. There's not going to be any humans pretty soon, right? In 100 years. Also, fame in 2026 is awful. You don't want fame. It's not what it used to be. Like in the olden days, you get famous and it's just all good things. But now you get famous and it's all bad things. It's just like pictures of you. You're going to see yourself, having sex with a donkey because of like AI. Somebody will make a funny video of you. It's just terrible. And anything you say can then be changed and screwed with, perverted into something else. The one book I wrote, Men Are All Murderers and Women Are All Whores, I was like, I would joke about how I've made it so that Disney will never buy it 100 years after I'm dead. And that the only way you can make it so that Disney doesn't get to cash in on your story 100 years after you're dead, you have to Disney proof it. You have to tailor make it so that there's no way they could ever make it into a Disney movie. And I gotta say, Men Are All Murderers and Women Are All Whores. There's no way you could edit that book to make it possible for it to be a Disney movie. You couldn't change one thing, or you'd have to change everything. Also, if I ever get YouTubers or like commenters on YouTube, or meet people in real life who are like, "Oh, you talk so tough. You talk so much about how this movie or this writer sucks. What have you ever done?" And it's like, okay, boom, there you go. You can shut up with that argument. Even though it's not the best argument, you don't have to do things in order to criticize them. Art criticism is a very worthwhile and noble career, endeavor, vocation, because you're the custodian of art. You're telling people this is the kind of art that's healthy for you to be watching or reading. So you don't have to have ever written anything, and you can still tear Quentin Tarantino to shreds and not be hypocritical. But of course, and it's barely anything to brag about, but my books are light years above anything that Tarantino's ever written or could ever hope to write. So there's Tarantino on the left and there's me on the right. So there was a great quote by a German writer named Goethe, Goethe. He was a German writer, very, very well respected. And he said that art is for the individual, not the masses. Anybody who creates art for the masses is in error. Now, one thing I like about Goethe is he doesn't refer to idiots and smart people. He refers to the masses versus the individual, which I think is a more civilized way of calling people idiots, or say, I'm smarter than you are. Okay, so the masses, those are the stupid people. And if you're making music or writing a story so that it'll get popular, that means you're writing it for the masses, and you are in error. That is not why you're supposed to do art. It's the opposite reason you would make art. And judging whether a work of art is good or not should, the question of whether the art is popular should not factor into your criticism of it. There's a term called the affective fallacy, and that is the idea that because Britney Spears sold 1 million tickets to her concert, that means she is therefore a good artist. And because Bach over there on the right, because nobody cared about his music for 200 years after he was dead, that does not mean he's a bad artist. One of the most famous sort of existential writers of all time, Kierkegaard was his name. He may even, the very idea of existentialism may have been based on him. I don't think it was Nietzsche. But Kierkegaard, when he died, or was it Kafka? No, it was Kafka. When Kafka was dying, he told his sister to destroy all of his writing. He said, oh yeah, destroy it all. And she did not. She refused, and she got it published. And that's the only reason why we know Kafka, the writer. So isn't that funny? Not only did he not care about getting famous, he actively tried not to get famous. Another great little story I have about corruption is George Lucas. I don't think he's especially corrupt. He pretty much stuck to his guns in terms of the Star Wars stories. But before George Lucas made Star Wars, he was making very experimental, provocative films, such as THX 1138. And then after he did Star Wars, he stopped making these interesting, daring films. So strictly as a filmmaker, Star Wars screwed Lucas up. And Francis Ford Coppola, the director, who was also friends with George Lucas, he said he was kind of George Lucas's mentor to a degree, I guess, or either that or he was just older and had more connections at the time. But he said that Star Wars was the worst thing that ever happened to George Lucas the reason that he stopped making artistic movies. Now, I've heard that, I've never read this myself, but I've heard that Nietzsche had a theory called the transvaluation of values. And I may be mistaken, but my understanding is that what he was saying was that Christians, the poor people, they decided to build Christianity because Christianity became a way of saying, well, because we're poor, we're going to turn it into a virtue. And because, they're rich, we're going to turn that into a sin. I can't get laid, so I'll say that abstinence is a virtue. And that guy who gets all the girls will say that what he's doing is sin, because we're jealous of him. So I'm a poor, unrecognized artist, so I'll come to the conclusion then, I'll reverse engineer it so that I chose to be poor because I have more integrity. I would say that both are true. Yeah, I am jealous of that guy that gets laid all the time, and I don't get hot supermodels. I'm not banging hot supermodels. So yeah, I'll turn it into a virtue that I don't have sex a lot. But at the same time, it turns out that it is a virtue. And of course, I'm jealous of Quentin Tarantino having money and the fact that if he makes a movie, millions of people are going to watch it. Of course, I'm jealous of that. But I've met enough people who have that, and enough people, and I've gotten to know them well enough to know that I'm not missing out on anything. That's all bullshit, anyways. Getting laid and the glitz and glamour of staying at a nice hotel and having fame and having adoring fans is really awesome for about 10 minutes, and then it just becomes nothing. But this Nietzsche transvaluation of values is the same as the story of the fox and the grapes. In case you haven't heard it, it's a fox sees some grapes and he says, "Wow, those look delicious. I can't." And he leaps and he tries to grab the grapes, but he can't reach them. So finally he gives up and he says, "That's okay. They were probably sour anyways." So that would be like me saying, "Yeah, I never got famous as Quentin Tarantino, but that's okay. I didn't want it anyways." So you didn't sell out, and now you're 80 years old and you're sitting in an alleyway in your own filth. You're drunk and you're sitting in your own puke and your own piss, and you're thinking, "Damn, I really should have sold out that time that that guy offered me, blah blah blah." Yeah, and maybe you would have been Tarantino, and then that would have been the worst. You made a choice, and there's going to be shitty things that come from that. But had you made the other choice, it might have been even worse. And some of the cool things that Tarantino never experiences. There's a lot of cool things about being an independent artist, an unknown underground artist. It already sounds pretty cool. You have the freedom to write whatever the hell you want, and that's no small thing. You actually get to perfect your craft, which was why you got into this in the first place. I once had a friend that I knew for like a year, and we were in a bar one day, and he introduced me to a female friend of his who happened to be like a violinist or something. And then I started mentioning like my favorite composers, and he suddenly looks at me and he goes, "What the hell? I've known you for a year. You never told me you knew all this stuff about classical music." And he goes, "I thought you were a jock." And I mean, that felt pretty cool. Like, it's cool that people don't know how much you know and that you can keep it a secret. And I said, of course, like, "Well, what did you want me to do? Just start listing all the things I know, all my accomplishments?" But I mean, I guess that anonymity, right? That's something that Tarantino will never have. Anyhow, always remember, at least you're not Tarantino.